strategies. Dr. Knight's research has been published in several top journals, including Educational Researcher and Education Finance and Policy, and his projects have received financial support from the National Science Foundation, the W.T. Grant Foundation, and the Lyle Spencer Foundation, and he is a fellow of the National Education Policy Center and serves on the Board of Trustees of the National Education Finance Academy. Please join me in extending a warm and virtual welcome to our speaker in this session, Dr. David Knight.
Thank you, Dr. Saldana, for that great introduction. I'm really excited to share with you all my talk, which is called Key Policy Issues in School Finance in the COVID-19 and Federal Stimulus Era. And I would just say folks could feel welcome to chime in if you want to stop me and have questions. Otherwise, I'll just fly through. Okay, I'm trying to get my picture. Oh, well. So I'll start with the outline of my talk. I'm going to kind of go through two big parts. In part one, I want to cover what are the key things we know and don't know about around school finance. And I'm going to frame part one all around the current policy context. And then in part two, I'll talk about what district, state, and federal leaders can do. And I'll kind of walk through at each of those three levels, district and then state, and then close with federal. So part one, what are the key things that we know and don't know about school finance, and framing it around our current policy context. And so I wanted to start with just kind of three basic facts about school finance. First, most of the money comes from state and local sources. So only about 10% of the money comes from federal sources. So when you have a large federal stimulus, like we had during the Great Recession and then more recently, it can sometimes set up what some people call a fiscal cliff. And that just means a school district has a lot of money one year that they're not going to have the next year. So some people call that a fiscal cliff. It just means less money than we used to have because it's short term. Second, kind of basic fact, the state revenue that districts receive, it's primarily comes from sales and income taxes. And those are revenue sources that are sensitive to economic shocks. And so that means that economic recessions can cause significant financial challenges for school districts, especially school districts that are more reliant on state aid. That's kind of in contrast to the property tax. So local tax revenues come primarily from property taxes, and property taxes are less cyclical with the economy. That's a benefit of local property taxes. The third kind of basic fact here is all of this money is then distributed on a per student basis. And that means that declining enrollment is a third kind of fiscal challenge for school districts. The reason why is not immediately obvious, because if you have declining enrollment, you also have declining costs. But the problem is some of those costs are fixed. And so you have a situation where revenues decline because funding is based on a per student allocation, and costs decline too, but cost decline less so. And so the obvious example here is if a school loses, let's just say 1 or 2 students per grade level, that school won't be able to reduce the number of teachers or class sections. And so they're going to lose revenues, but they won't necessarily be able to reduce costs to the same extent in the short term. And then to the extent that they can, a school or district can reduce the number of teachers or even schools, that's also a very painful process. And we have some policy recommendations around what to do in that case. So those are kind of 3 basic facts. And now I want to turn to, given those facts, where that puts us in the current context. So kind of laying out 3 fiscal challenges ahead. Before I even list those 3, it kind of seems important to mention the ongoing impacts of COVID, and not just on learning, but also students' mental health, and not just students, but staff and folks working in schools. So in addition to that background, there's 3 fiscal challenges moving forward. One I mentioned is what folks are calling the fiscal cliff, but essentially all the federal stimulus money that came in, it needs to be spent this school year. And so the deadline to spend the money is September 2024. And that's a problem for 2 reasons. First, a lot of the ESSER money, if you look at survey data from RAND, a lot of the ESSER money was spent on technology. technology operates on a replacement cycle. So if a district invested in one-to-one devices or something like that, every few years, those devices then need to be replaced. And so if the ESSER money's gone, they'll have to find state aid to fix that patch, or the tech will go away. And then the second kind of related and more obvious thing is that we know from survey data from RAND that a lot of the ESSER money was spent on staff. And so at the end of this school year, that staff will either need to be laid off or will need to be supported through state or local funds. So that's the first kind of big challenge that's afoot. Second is declining enrollment. This is an ongoing problem in many urban districts, but there's sort of some bleak projections in the next 10 years about what's going to happen to public school enrollment. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the third thing is the talk of a potential recession. And that, as I mentioned, has serious implications for school districts. We also just experienced record high inflation, but seems to finally be coming down in the most recent months of data. But most economists still think that a recession is likely in 2024. Okay, so that's sort of three fiscal challenges ahead. I'm going to kind of walk through each of those and then along the way talk about what we know about what the research says about these issues. Okay, so just to put a few numbers on the ESSER stimulus, there was 3 stimulus packages. The third one was passed under Biden. It was the largest. All told, it was $190 billion. If you kind of put that into practical terms, it means the money spent over about 3 years. So for the typical district, it's between 5 and 20% increase in the amount of funds that districts were having total. And then all of this money comes in and it has relatively few strings attached other than the timeline, which is that it has to be spent this school year. So if we look at how the money was distributed to school districts, there's wide variation in how much money each district got. So what you can see here, particularly with ESSER 3, the ARP, some districts got as much as $3,000 and $4,000 per student. Others got a lot less. This is data for Washington, which has pretty good ESSER data, but this pattern is similar across the country. And so then we can look at which types of districts got more money. And ESSER was distributed progressively. It went through the Title I formula, which was good. We kind of was something we learned from the last recession. But what that means is that those districts, higher poverty districts and districts serving greater percentages of students of color, they got more ESSER money and now they're going to face a larger ESSER cliff. And so that's just something we have to be mindful of. Okay, so that's the first major fiscal challenge ahead. I've got a couple of thoughts in part 2 on how we can address that, but I'll next talk about declining enrollment. So looking at, I think folks are aware of what happened during the COVID-19 school closures is that there was this huge decline in enrollment and then a slight bounce back in the more recent years of data. But moving forward, it's projected that there will be declining enrollment. And I mentioned earlier that there's quite a bit of research. David Arson has one paper out looking at why do school districts tend to get into financial trouble, and particularly in the short term, declining enrollment is a big factor. It's not going to happen similarly across states. Texas and Florida are actually predicting slight enrollment increases, so there'll be more kids attending schools in those states. But if you look at the entire West Coast and the entire Northeast, are all predicting massive enrollment declines over the next 10 years. Something that I do want to point out, so this is also going to show enrollment over time, and it's something I often get asked. The media loves to talk about enrollment decline because it's often associated with budget cuts. And so a common question is, what is the school district doing wrong? And what I try to point out is this is a national phenomenon, and it's even easier to make that argument if you look at a regional case. So in this graph, there was a bunch of media trying to figure out what Seattle was doing wrong during the pandemic. And so in 2022, as a bunch of stories came out that Seattle had just gone this record decline in enrollment. But it's really important that we pay attention to the fact that this is a regional trend. And so all of these districts were experiencing declines that were not really the school districts don't necessarily have control over these factors. And that has an obvious policy implication that higher levels of governance may need to support some of the fiscal challenges that all of these districts would be facing. And so this brings us to the third fiscal challenge, which is the potential for a recession. And we have quite a bit of research on the impacts of recessions from the Great Recession. And so this was a graph we made that tracks total revenues from before the Great Recession and through it. And what you can see here is that once the recession comes in, there was federal stimulus under Obama as the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and it helps stave off these huge declines in state revenue. Remember, state revenue is so more sensitive to shocks to the economy. And high poverty districts are more reliant on state aid. They get a larger proportion of their revenues come from state aid because of the way state aid is allocated to make up for disparities in local revenues. So what you can see is, so the federal stimulus comes in, but then there's this, fiscal cliff of federal revenues declining. It was just a short-term stimulus. And once that happens, you can see total revenue start to drop because state revenue never bounces back in the years after the recession. It's a little bit of a similar pattern for low poverty districts, but their state revenue doesn't decline by as much. And so what's the outcome of all of this? Does it matter? Yes, it really does matter. And it actually was right around when COVID finally happened. It took almost 10 years for these studies to come out, looking at the impacts of these budget cuts on student achievement. And so Bo Jackson has a paper out, and Chris Candelaria linking these budget cuts to declines in student outcomes. The other thing to point out, these kind of high poverty and low poverty schools are different types of, these are all school districts, but it's important to keep in mind, many times these school districts are located right next to each other. And so this was a study looking at the distribution of teacher quality in Texas. And so it's just important to point out that the reason why those sorts of resource disparities matter is because most of the money spent on teachers and other staff and teacher labor markets are regional and highly localized. So these high poverty districts that are located right next to each other, they're competing in the same teacher labor market. So if we have state policies that are all of a sudden going to create big resource disparities, that's going to lead to what we see in panel B, which is also big disparities in the types of teachers that districts are able to hire. And one of the things we point out in this paper is we have a bunch of different measures of teacher quality, and in every commuting zone or every labor market, there's a lot of high and low sort of qualified teachers. And so if we can get the finance piece right, each labor market has a set of highly qualified teachers to attract. So just to kind of bring a lot of those pieces together, what happens when states and districts actually do need to cut funding? A district will often implement something called a reduction in force process. They'll cut services, after-school programs. We know from the research that achievement declines. But really importantly is that some of the students are exposed to greater budget cuts than others. And so I talked in that last graph that showed that some districts were getting higher budget cuts. And that's what happened during the Great Recession. For a different set of reasons within school districts, some schools will sometimes distribute a disproportionate number of teacher layoffs or staff reductions across schools. And so the reason why that happens, we talk about it in this paper. A lot of districts are using sort of what's called a last in, first out layoff policy, which has merit behind it, but one of the outcomes is that the layoffs are disproportionately allocated across schools. And so we have some recommendations around that too, which I'll get to in part 2. Okay, so I want to walk through the set of policy recommendations, and we kind of start at the state district, and then I'll close on the federal. And before I jump into that, I wanted to kind of remind people what happened when the COVID-19 kind of first happened, and there was a lot of fear that there was going to be massive recession and that state revenues were going to decline. And I mentioned all of that research at the time was just coming out about the Great Recession. And so what did federal policymakers do? Well, first of all, Ed Trust and a group of other folks lobbied Congress to try to put in equity-based safeguards around budget cuts. And they were largely successful. Federal policymakers did put these safeguards into the ESSER bills. They called it maintenance of equity, and it prevented states and districts from disproportionately reducing funding for high poverty districts and schools. It's right there in ARP and the other ESSER bills. It was difficult to implement. So Washington State right now is their maintenance of equity process is under review. And essentially what happened was every single district in the state applied for an exemption. And so, but the other thing that happened was there wasn't a big recession, right? The state economies bounced back really quickly. And so the maintenance of equity provisions were sort of moot and didn't really hold teeth after that anyways. So we don't really have a test to see if this worked, other than we know we can get it into the law. But so this is really important. And especially now, because it seems like there might be a recession in 2024. And so it's really important that we, again, prioritize equity if there's going to be budget cuts. So talk a little bit about how we would go about doing that. So first, starting at the district level, if a district is going to implement budget cuts, they'll often implement this thing called the reduction in force. And so we have studied this during the Great Recession, and they'll use a pretty common method. Whether or not it's in law, they'll kind of, most districts will resort back to this kind of going by seniority, which makes sense for a lot of different reasons. But so what we would encourage districts to do would be to protect high need schools from teacher layoffs, be thinking about the teacher workforce, racial diversity. If your most novice teachers are more diverse, then you wouldn't want to disproportionately target novice teachers for layoffs, even though that's sometimes in the law. And you can put protections in place for some teachers or schools. And the last thing that districts often try to do is protect student-facing staff. So just give a quick example of when I'm talking about protecting high-need schools. Los Angeles Unified, when they implemented a major reduction in force, they did identify 45 schools. Well, the first thing that happened was that they were sued by the ACLU in 2009 after their first major reduction in force. And then that lawsuit ended up forcing the district to protect 45 schools from teacher layoffs. And so they were called READ schools. And so what we found in this study was that the policy was effective, and that layoffs went down in the protected schools, obviously, but that the policy was effective at reducing the inequality in the distribution of teacher layoffs. It also wasn't really that complicated. And I think when we were doing this study, a lot of reformers really don't like last in, first out. They'd much rather the layoffs be based on value added or some sort of totally subjective measure. And so that's also impractical. So there was a lot of excitement about this court case because it, not necessarily for equity purposes, but because it was going to get away from seniority-based lockstep layoffs. But the outcome was, I think, demonstrates a nice way of how you can kind of have it both ways of having a more equitable distribution of layoffs while still using something that's fair and objective to make decisions. And so these would be a few straightforward recommendations we would put forward, which would be to protect higher need schools and teachers, and think about student-facing staff. Okay, so we'll say move over to what states should do in the context of a budget cut. So this was a graph we made basically going into the F33 school finance survey, which is available nationally. It covers all school districts in the country. And it tracks federal, state, and local revenues. And we took every single state funding stream, which is there's only about 12 or 13 in that survey. And we wanted to know, how is each state funding stream, how progressive is it? Is it within each one, are they sending more money to higher poverty or lower poverty schools or other types of student demographics? And so most of the money goes through general formula assistance. And the second most common category in the federal data set is other. So a takeaway from this was the general fund is pretty progressive. If you look at all US school districts, that's just kind of their basic formula funding. And then everything else is pretty small. So there wasn't much we could go on from this exercise, actually, which is why the real recommendation is to go to state finance data and look at their what is sometimes called program activity accounting, PAO, program activity object accounting. So if you go into the general fund of every single school district, they'll disaggregate all their expenditures by those three categories: program, activity, and object. So, or activity can sometimes be called function, but these are all the activities, these are the programs. And so we wanted to know the same question, which if we break it down by program, are there some that are more progressive than others? And somewhat surprisingly, there was actually I think 41 different programs, and we don't display them all here, but these are the largest ones. There was only 2 that were substantially progressive. So in the state of Washington, only 2 state funding streams were sending substantially more revenues to higher poverty school districts. And so a couple of recommendations came out of this exercise. The first couple are obvious. Don't cut those 2. So don't cut Learning Assistance Program if you're needed to make cuts. That's a program that allocates extra funds based on the percent of students who are eligible for FRL. Local effort assistance is our tax-based equalization program. So don't cut those. Don't make across the board general fund cuts. That's what we did during the Great Recession. And we saw that because some districts rely more on state aid than others, an across the board cut is actually not even equal. The third thing, we would recommend against even cutting the general fund progressively. What the reviewer on this paper asked that question: why not just recommend to cut the general fund progressively? The problem with that is, even if you have a low poverty school district, they're serving some high need kids in that district, and if you cut so those are the districts you're going to target the most under this policy. And if you do that, if a low poverty district has a large general fund reduction, what are they going to do? They're probably going to make cuts that are going to disproportionately harm their highest need kids. And so instead of doing that, we'd recommend this fourth dot, which is go through this exercise and look for specific programs that are regressive and determine why is it, for example, in this case, why are state funds paid directly to districts for capital projects funds so disproportionately benefiting the wealthiest school districts in the state? And we found out this was part of a SCAP, this program called SCAP, which was stood for basically capital project improvements. And so this is an exercise that states should be able to conduct on their own. Okay, so I'm going to kind of close up here with recommendations around federal policy moving forward. So one thing that was recommended during, we kind of go back a couple of years during the presidential campaign, there was a lot of energy around increasing Title I funding. And so technically, technically we did triple Title I under the ARP and ESSER acts, but I think doing it through stimulus is obviously not sustainable. And so getting back to the conversation of actually increasing formula funding is really important. And second, fully funding the nation's special education law. I think IDEA is an underappreciated social justice law that can be leveraged more, perhaps. So two things that could be done would be to better enforce child find, and to I'll talk about each of these things and update this thing called the SEEP study. So what is child find? It's just the federal law that requires school districts to identify and provide services to students with disabilities. And in some cases, state agencies and school districts have really dropped the ball on this, and that's led to huge problems. And so there was a case, the Houston Chronicle uncovered this situation in Texas with a series of these reports, and ultimately leading to impact studies showing that this really hurt children, but then ultimately leading to a Department of Education investigation. And something we point out in a couple papers we wrote on this was that this was obvious and researchers should have found it earlier, but essentially the state put in this accountability incentive to get your special education enrollment rates below 8.5%, and districts listened to it and reduced their special education and denied and delayed students services that they were federally had a right to. And so that's one, if there's going to be a nationwide decline in enrollment, then getting this part right and making sure that we have services to kids who need them, I think would be one useful approach. The other thing is getting a better sense of what we pay for special education. And so I didn't know about this study until about relatively recently, because it's now being next edition of it is being done. But there is this study that's in its fifth round. It started in 1968. It's called the Special Education Expenditure Project. And one of the findings, so it's actually one of the only student level school finance data sets I've ever seen in my life. But so it's tracking expenditures down to the student level. Most people are excited about school level finance data. And so what they did with the survey data was track the actual expenditures on individual students, and they compared students in special education to students who don't have an IEP. And one of the key findings that they've had in all four of the studies is that even among students in the same school, a student with an IEP receives roughly twice as much resources and has twice the amount of expenditures spent on them than a student who doesn't have an IEP. That's pretty remarkable when you think about the huge disparities in resources across schools or districts. How important it is if you need those services to have an IEP. It generates a lot of extra resources for you. The other finding from this study was that when you add up all the expenditures on special education and then you look at the funding that comes through IDEA funding represents only about 10.2% of additional expenditures on special ed, which means that states are paying for special ed out of their own. States and districts are having to cover 90% of the special education expenditures. So if you look at schools and districts with higher percentages of kids in special ed, and we know that charter schools can sometimes alter the rates of special ed in schools, but it means that something we know in the school finance literature is that special ed can put a little bit of financial pressure on the general fund. So that would be another federal thing to watch out for moving forward. So just to kind of wrap up here, so I started with 3 big fiscal challenges moving forward: the fiscal cliff, declining enrollment, and potential economic recession. And there's things that leaders could be doing at all levels, starting from the district level. If we do see teacher layoffs, we kind of have a playbook for what not to do. And then school closures, there's lots of research looking at school closures, and that's going to be a hot topic, I think, in the next few years. At the state level, there's also a whole bunch of really good research. Lots of different folks have done looking at the Great Recession. And so these are a few fairly straightforward recommendations. And then I'm hoping that the feds will come back to these 2 big topics, which I think are going to be important. And that's all I have prepared. I forgot to check the time.
You're great. So we do have time for like maybe 1 or 2 questions if folks have that, but otherwise, thank you so much, Dr. Knight. This fellows can go back to the meeting link that Kate Somerville sent you, and then she's going to break folks up into small groups. But we do have time for like 1 or 2 questions if anybody wanted to bring them up, and if David would be nice enough to answer them.
There's one question about what's driving declining enrollment. And Jess Gardner, she's got a really nice blog post on that question. But she points out that there's, in the past decade, what you will hear is that people will say it's homeschooling and private schooling. And private schooling is actually down since 2000. Homeschooling's up a little, but homeschooling is actually pulling out private schooling. So what's actually happening is since 2016, there's been a pretty substantial drop in immigration once Trump took office, and then that hasn't slowed down since COVID. 2, birth rates are down, the boomers are getting older, and that's been a trend. Those are the 2 things, immigration and birth rates. But the media, that's not a great story to tell in the media, right? It's much more interesting to talk about private schools and failing public schools.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions before I close up our meeting? And as a reminder, our NEPC fellows, go find that link that Kate Somerville sent. I will just keep saying that because I know it's easy to lose it. And thank you, Emily, for putting out that link. All right, well, thank you so much. David, again, this is the end of the presentation, and thank you, members of the CU community, for joining us. Fellows, I'll see you back in the main room where we'll be able to engage in some other discussion. Thank you all so much. See you soon.